Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Megan Altus. I'm the director of the St. Augustine Historical Society. Jay Smith works at the St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum as the Development and Grants Manager. He received his master's in American History from the University of North Florida, go Ospreys, and received a bachelor's in History and Political Science from Florida State University. Go Noles! He is a native to St. Augustine, born in Flagler Hospital back when it was on Marine Street. His father, Neil, worked for 32 years at the Florida East Coast Railway, and his mom, Carolyn, taught at St. Joseph Academy when it was back on South St. George Street, and 2 years at the new campus. Jay has spent many hours at the Historical Society Research Library, delighting the librarians and staff. He wrote annoying, but he is very appreciative of their help and support. This presentation is the culmination of several years of digging through church records and online records. The Presbyterian congregation celebrated its 200th anniversary in 2024. And as with any organization, the history of the Presbyterian congregation tells us more about the larger community it serves. Since 1824, the Presbyterians have contributed much to the culture, history, and people of St. Augustine. We want to thank Memorial Presbyterian Church, as well as Dr. Hunter Camp and Andrew Brown, for allowing us to use this sanctuary for a presentation. Thank you for being here, and without any further delay, please welcome Jay Smith.
Okay, so I have my cheat sheets because it's a lot of information, 200 years. And I wasn't sure I'd remember it all, so I always have to have my cheat sheets. So speaking about the Presbyterians, it's been fun digging through archives, annoying the staff of the Historical Society with questions. And it's funny because Megan, I think, probably has something, not Megan, Nicole probably has something on her email where it sends my emails directly to trash. But by now she probably does, but I can always get something out of her. Okay. Technology. I may have it covered up. Or my batteries died. That's even more fun. Okay, we'll do it this way. There we go. Okay. So it occurred to me probably Tuesday night at midnight that it might be interesting to break this up a little bit into 4 different areas. From 1824 to 1860, I call planting the seed of faith. So this is when the congregation begins. This is when we begin to get our first ministers coming in. And then as we move forward, we're kind of nurturing that growth. And largely, St. Augustine is very, very, very different from in 1824 than it is today. And it's a little hard to imagine that. Because we're probably, 300,000, 400,000 people, maybe more than that, compared to little old bitty St. Augustine. But if you can imagine, St. Augustine has all of these amazing historical things that happen. You can't walk around a corner in St. Augustine without bumping into history or tripping over it, in my case. But really the pivotal thing that changes the congregation's history is in 1890 when Henry Flagler donates this amazing building and the adjoining manse. So that's kind of the hinge on this whole presentation. And funny because I don't want that to overshadow anything else that's happening. So I'm not going to talk a lot about Flagler, which for me is really, really, really hard to do. And then the congregation kind of wounds up, I wind it up with Dr. John Hunter. And so we'll kind of move a little bit faster as we get closer to the modern era. Okay, so of course you have to have a little bit of Florida history. So most people don't know this, but part of Florida was originally part of Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. The United States kind of came in, took that territory from Spain during the Second Spanish period, and it ends up getting glopped onto the very bottom of Alabama and Mississippi. And the reason is because those states wanted Gulf access. So Florida lost some of that territory. So when Florida becomes part of the Adams-Onis Treaty, it's a little bit smaller than it started out being. And one of the things that this treaty does is it basically takes care of some tight, or some loose ends, so to speak, from the Louisiana Purchase. There's also, they throw in something about the Oregon Territory that the United States wants to be able to settle Oregon, and Spain basically gives up its right to the Oregon Territory. It's just a bunch of stuff. A very complicated treaty, and no wonder most people don't even know it exists. But the main thing is that the United States agrees to settle claims for the United States on Spain's behalf to the amount of about $5 million. The United States doesn't write a check to Spain for $5 million, they just pay these claims. So it's not actually a cash exchange. So that's a pretty good deal, especially for the winter playground that it becomes. So we have the change of flags, July 10th, 1821. Pensacola goes first, St. Augustine goes second, in terms of the changing of the flag. That drives me nuts, because Pensacola and St. Augustine have this rivalry thing going on. Our people stayed, their people left. But one of the things that happens right after 1820 is Florida begins to blow up, but not in the area where you think it would. It's actually in the middle Florida area. And so when you look at the number of counties that Florida adds by 1827, you'll notice a lot of these are in West Florida. So what's driving all of that growth in middle Florida? Cotton. So if you've ever taken a drive over by Quincy, and you go up around Tallahassee, the rolling hills of Florida that don't look anything like Miami, all of that soil is perfect for growing cotton. And so all of these people from South Carolina, North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee flood down to Florida because they can get land grants and they can get property. And they bring their families, their slaves, whatever they can with them. And they begin to set up these huge plantations. And it really does not take very long for them to be able to get Florida in as a state. And largely it's because of middle Florida. Right off the mark, East Florida is very leery of what's happening in middle Florida, because the people in East Florida are not major plantation holders. Most of them aren't that wealthy. But middle Florida is. Middle Florida has a lot of money. And so when the state starts talking about making a capital in Tallahassee, East Florida is very nervous about that. So your St. Augustine in 1820 is not your Chamber of Commerce, VCB, TDC, picture book, St. Augustine. The picture that's there, the earliest I could get was about 1860. Sam Cooley comes through during the Civil War and takes a bunch of pictures, and it's not real pretty. I mean, it's cute, it's quaint, but the streets are all dirt, and they're all in black and white. But some of the quotes that I thought was very interesting. By 1821, you have a man named Citizen who writes to the paper complaining about the fact that people leave their garbage in their yard, they're not fixing up their houses. The public buildings in St. Augustine are in horrible shape because Spain, up until 1819, thought that Florida would get purchased by the United States. So why should they invest money in keeping up the public government buildings when the United States was just going to come in and do it? So it's not really Florida's fault, it's just the way it kind of was going. But citizens said no one the least acquainted with large towns can walk our streets without feeling astonishment that the yellow fever is not among us. So this is right about the time that they start having the yellow fever epidemic pop in. My favorite are the two quotes at the bottom, my two favorites. Lieutenant Calvin Shield, who was stationed here, St. Augustine is a dull, old place now, and I should think there was not much life here at any time. In the same letter, he says, this must be a nice place for northerners to live in winter, and it is strange to me that more do not, especially the rich. Anyone could make a Garden of Eden here at a quarter of the expense that some spend north on an ordinary affair. He nails it, right? Sometimes I wonder about the dull thing because we're sitting in traffic a lot these days. So there are two denominations that are already active in St. Augustine. Obviously, we know the Catholic denomination is active. You've got the cathedral, Spain and the Catholic Church are connected totally. One is not without the other. So the problem that arises when the United States takes Florida over is what do you do with the government buildings that are religious? So there's an argument about what to do with the cathedral, because the cathedral is technically a government building, even though it's the center for the Catholics to worship in. So they get into a little tiff over that, but then of course end up solving the problem. And most of us know, 1887, the cathedral burns. Henry Flagler comes along and rebuilds it, along with James Renwick. James Renwick designs the bell tower that gets added. Okay. And sites related to the Catholic community, I didn't write anything down, so I don't know what I was thinking there. Obviously, the Colorado Cemetery is part of the Spanish government because it falls again under the Catholic Church. So they got to figure out what to do with all this land and how to divide it. The other denomination, of course, is the Episcopal Church. So remember, East Florida was a British colony during the American Revolution, 1763 to 1783. The state British government had the Anglican Church here. So Trinity actually sits on the site of the former Episcopal Church that was there during the British period. But they still have to get organized, and so that takes them a little while. And there is at one point a connection between the Presbyterians and Episcopalians where they decide that they're going to create a union house of worship. So it would be a church that both the Presbyterians and Episcopalians use. The problem comes when the Presbyterians are starting to fundraise, because we think like that, Presbyterians, we're always about the money. And the Episcopalians, they're hitting the Presbyterians up, or the Presbyterians are hitting the Episcopalians up for the money now, rather than, you gave us a pledge for $500, let's see that $500. And so it creates a rift between the two congregations. And so that plan falls apart. And of course, the Episcopalians end up building their own church, which is Trinity Episcopal. And at this point in time, it's still kind of just a one-room building. It does not have the extension. But you know what? I think I wrote it down. Did I? Yeah. No, I didn't. Building expanded in 1902. Ironically, before 1902, Henry Flagler walks into the vestry at Trinity Episcopal with Herrera and Hastings, and he says, I want to demolish your church, but I'm going to build you a better one. Sound familiar? Well, Presbyterians were like, yeah, sure, why not? We don't know what it looked like. We have no idea what the plans were. My thought is it's the plans for this building. But I have my own theory about that. Anyway, the Episcopalians are like, you know what, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to keep what we got. And they end up expanding the sanctuary towards South St. George Street. It's okay, we got the better deal. So Presbyterianism in East Florida has its roots in South Georgia, specifically Liberty County. And CJ and I were talking about this. Near Darien, there's a little town called Midway. And Midway is between Savannah and a ghost town now called Sunbury. Sunbury and Savannah were vying for commercial trade. And Sunbury was a little port that was growing and prospering, but ended up Savannah won out. And Sunbury goes bye-bye. There's nothing left today except a cemetery. But the Midway Presbyterian Church that's right there on the highway was completed in 1792, and that is the mother church for our congregation, and actually several in South Georgia. So if you look at it, that looks like a Presbyterian church, right? This does not. I think John Calvin is still turning in his grave. Dorchester Presbyterian Church is a second church coming out of Midway, and these are called the retreat churches. And what they mean by that is that if you lived along the coast during the summer, during malaria season, you moved inland. Otherwise, you would catch malaria and die. So that's a pretty good reason to do it. And so they would worship and have homes in this retreat community. And that's basically, you just picked up your life and you moved inland for a little while and then you moved back. So these churches were not used year-round, which is kind of interesting. Okay. Dorchester, in the bell tower up there, they have the bell from Sunbury, from the town of Sunbury, which is kind of a cool thing. I'm not even going to try to pronounce Waltherville. You know, I don't know. Anyway, Flemington, these are two churches that are also, about the same time period, they're also retreat churches. And so all of this, there's a gentleman that comes to St. Augustine who is the chief educator within the town of Sunbury. So why are we bringing Presbyterianism to East Florida in the first place? What does it mean? And basically what the Synod of Georgia and South Carolina, they bring this issue. It's actually Eleazar Lathrop, who is a missionary from the American Missionary Society, who comes to East Florida and is charged with creating a congregation. And he's actually really effective. But he goes to the Synod and he basically asks them for support. And the Synod says, yeah, sure, this is a great thing. More people, more money, more tithing. This is great for the church. Let's do it. But they don't really want to do it. They've got to find some sucker that will do it for them. And they're going to find them. The other thing is what's going on in East Florida. So I used AI a little bit. And this was the picture. I was trying to come up with a picture that would be, you know, like gambling and sin and debauchery. So that's what AI came up with. People in St. Augustine are not following the Sabbath. They open their store on Sunday morning. Oh, Lord, that's the worst possible thing you could possibly imagine. They're playing cards, they're drinking, they're completely crazy. Some things never change. Obviously, Scarlett O'Hara's was open back then. But there's one other thing that they're talking about, which it took me a minute to figure out what it was that they were talking about. And so the quote is, "Wherever this channel may terminate on this side of the peninsula, there a town will rise up as if by magic." So they're talking about a channel on this side of the Atlantic. What are they talking about? Not the St. John's. Close. It's something that we don't really think about anymore. The Cross Florida Barge Canal. They were talking about this in the 1820s. And I thought, that's insane. But it's the truth. So, and of course, this is from the modern collateral from when the barge canal was being done. But in 1820, I think it's 1824, they come out with a map. And they start in the St. Mary's River, and it winds down, starts way up here, and it winds down, and basically creates this waterway. And the idea is that whatever town is right near all of this is going to prosper from this increased trade coming from the Gulf of Mexico to the Atlantic. It's like the Panama Canal of Florida. And I thought, well, that's ingenious. I can't believe they're still talking about that. But anyway, now we don't talk about it because we know it was a ginormous ecological disaster, and we're still dealing with the ramifications of it today. But back then, this was the big deal. So it kind of makes you wonder if maybe that's one of the things behind the purchase of Florida, or the acquisition of Florida. So this grumpy guy is Reverend Eliezer Lathrop, and this is another picture I ran through AI. He looks like, I don't know, the Emperor from Star Wars or something. But Lathrop is the money man. So this is the missionary who comes down from up north. He's young, may not look at that picture, but he is a young guy, fresh out of seminary, very gung-ho, and he's a missionary. So he's going to be evangelizing to the population. And he actually has a great deal of success. But it's going to take two people to do this. And he quickly realizes that. And so he goes to the synod, he asks for money, but he also asks for support. And so they are going to send him somebody in just a second. I don't know where that slide is, but anyway. So he talks about the moral and religious atmosphere of Florida. These people need religion. They need Presbyterians to help, center the moral compass in this debaucherous town of St. Augustine in East Florida. And we'll talk a little bit more about why they think that. There he is. Looks like Admiral Akbar from Star Wars. But this is Dr. William McWhirr, straight from Ireland. Grew up in Ireland, went to seminary in Ireland. He stops off in Alexandria, Virginia, where he starts a school. And the grandniece of George Washington, grandniece and nephew of George Washington, go to his school, and he becomes really good friends with George Washington. Looks like he could have a party, huh? Fascinating, fascinating man. And the quotes, I think, are really great. So Charles Colcock Jones, who ends up being one of the more famous Presbyterian ministers from the South, refers to him, let me get a little closer. The name of no man who ever lived in Georgia was more intimately identified with the cause of education. As a teacher, his chief merits were thoroughness of instruction and the most exact discipline, such as would in these days be esteemed too rigorous. So he was like a nun in Catholic school, but the Protestant version of that. And then Eugenia Jones Bacon, and if you notice the Jones connection, Liberty County is full of the Jones family, very prominent family. She refers to him to shield his name, but calls him Father McCall, but she's talking about McWhirr. He died at the age of 83 at a neighbor's in a room named Purgatory. Great name for a room. Owing to his dislike for the old clergyman, whom he nevertheless had to entertain, the host had assigned him to this chamber. So obviously, not really beloved in the community, but certainly an interesting figure. And he's a very interesting figure. If you get a chance, there are several sources I can refer you to on Reverend McWeir. But he has a really good time in St. Augustine recruiting members for the congregation. And he is what Lathrop needs in order to be the boots on the ground so that Lathrop can do the money, because the money is the problem. So if you know about Florida in the 1820s, 1840s, and the whole state is really a planter society, people did not have a lot of cash. So if you're trying to develop or grow a church and you need money to do that, you're not going to be able to go knock on somebody's door and say, hey, can you give me $5-10, towards the church, because they just don't have it. Because everything is mortgaged until you get your next sale or crop. So Lathrop figures out pretty quickly he's going to have to go up north and hit up a lot of the missionary societies and write a lot of articles and letters in newspapers and missionary newsletters in order to get the money. And so, meanwhile, while he's doing that, McWhirr is on the warpath to get the congregation going. And so they have a series of meetings starting June 10th. They meet at the home of Elias Wallen, of interested people who want to join and create this congregation. The next day, they meet at Judge Smith's house, and they talk about who the ruling elders are going to be. In the Presbyterian Church, you have to have ruling elders. If you don't have a pastor, the ruling elders can serve communion, and that's the main sacrament. I think I got that right. I'm glad Amy and Hunter aren't here, because I think that's right, but But anyway, so William E. Blair and Elias Gould are selected as the ruling elders. Then on June 13th, the elders provide their testimony before the other members. And by doing that, it's basically like a witnessing or testimony to be approved as ruling elders. And so McWhirr then ordains Gould and Blair as ruling elders. At that point, the church is formed, the congregation is formed, because you have two ruling elders now. And then on the 20th, they have a worship service. So they weren't meeting in people's houses anymore because they had a larger group, so they were meeting in Government House. And there's a whole discussion about how Government House is falling in, the military wants to take it, the civil government wants to take it, and so the military and the mayor start getting in a fight over who's going to have Government House, and they're trying to figure out what to do with it. But in the middle of all this, you've got the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians using it for Sunday service, so they're alternating every other week. So the service is what formally organizes the Presbyterian Church. And these are the members who are considered the founders. So William Blair, Elias Gould, Elias Wallen, John Alden, Jane Wallen, Catherine Storrs, Lydia Gould, Hannah Whitmore, Ann Tingle, Ann Robinson, Rachel Gertie, Fanny Smith, and Ellen Riddle. And most of these people are from a cross-section of the community. Gould and Wallen are probably what you would consider higher status, as well as the Blairs. But then you have Rachel Gertie, who is a widow. She's a teacher. And it's her property, for those of us who have heard of the Burt Fund. We have a fund that helps indigent church members. That fund comes from rent paid for Rachel Gertie's property. Rachel Gertie, when she died, the Burts assumed her property, It was bequeathed to them. And so the Cell Shop or something across from the Pena Peck House is the property that we rent as a church to a store, and that income goes into our fund. Sorry, that's very, very confusing. One of the ways that Lathrop begins to evangelize within the community is using the Sabbath school. And Sabbath schools began in the 1740s. There's a German Seventh-day Adventist who is credited with creating the first Sabbath school. So think of this, you don't have public schools, especially in the South. So churches use this as a way to extend their reach into the community. So not only are they educating children on how to read and write, but they're also teaching them the lessons and tenets of the faith. And that's really what the Sabbath school was supposed to do. And we have a lot of success with that here in St. Augustine. And so Lathrop is the one that really starts it going. He gets, it's actually $2,000 from the American Home Missionary Society to be able to buy and purchase the materials for the school. And so they're using it for both parents and children. So they have the school during the day for the kids, and then in the evening, they'll have a Bible study. And the idea is to get the children and the parents to join. Okay. Yeah. So 1821, you have the yellow fever epidemic. And this is why we have the Huguenot Cemetery in town. So at this point, St. Augustine is still going through this period of transition from Spanish control to American control. The worst possible time to have a crisis is the exact time when a crisis appears. And this is what happens. And so the civil government hasn't even had a chance to fill all of the positions, and suddenly you have all of these people who are dying from yellow fever. The first person to die is a territorial judge named Thomas Finch. Chances are he probably wasn't the first to die. He's the first out of the population that gets noticed. The second person is a guy named Jean Pinier, who was the Indian agent. He's French, friend of Marquis de Lafayette, who comes to Florida. He's fine on a Friday night, laughing, having a good time with some friends, and then by the end of the next week, he's dead. So it moves very, very fast through the population. And then Richard Edis, maybe? Florida Gazette, he's the editor of the Florida Gazette, is the next victim. So you're in a Catholic town, a former Catholic town, and we were laughing about this earlier. There's cemeteries all over St. Augustine. Well, I should say their bodies buried all over St. Augustine. There are only 3 cemeteries. So they got to figure out, what do we do? And I'm trying not to be irreverent, but what do you do with a bunch of dead Protestants? Because you don't have a seminary for them. You got to find one. And so they create this committee, and the committee goes and searches out and tries to find land. And so this is a map of the Spanish defenses. So when Florida was under Spain, and this is probably first Spanish period when Spain was really very vigorous, the part that's circled is the area where the Huguenot Cemetery is. So when you have the city gates, outside the city gates, everything was level. And the whole idea was this would prevent people from being able to hide behind trees or buildings or anything if they're approaching the city. It makes it very easy for you to shoot them if they're an enemy. But it also deters them from coming because most likely they realize there's nowhere to hide. You're going to die if you approach the city gates. So all of that land was owned by the Spanish government. During the periods of peace, when they were not at war with someone, the Spanish government in St. Augustine would allow people to go out and plant crops on that land. and then harvest those crops. But in the time of war, if you have crops out there, sorry, they're just a casualty of a battle. So anyway, that's what becomes of that property. So it's part of the Spanish land, the Spanish government. And this is an image of the cemetery. That's the San Marco Hotel, which is the first luxury hotel in St. Augustine, right there by the city gates. And there's the very nice manicured sidewalk cemetery, very pretty. This is, I think it's an 1885 map. Okay, we're not there yet. Okay, so what ends up happening is there is a Presbyterian minister named Reverend Thomas Alexander, and he pops up all over the state. This is like he's a historian's worst nightmare, because he goes from St. Augustine to Madison to Tallahassee to Pensacola. You're like, is this the same guy? With a name like Thomas Alexander, it's like J. Smith. There are a million of us. What's he doing? And so he is a Presbyterian minister who comes from up north. He has a respiratory problem with his lungs. It's not consumption or TB, but he comes to Florida hoping that the warmer climate will help him. He had served in South Carolina with one of the churches in South Carolina and had to resign and come down to St. Augustine. So he's kind of helping out where he feels like he can really add something. Well, Thomas Alexander purchases that territory, that land, that piece of land, from a man who has a Spanish land grant from the Spanish government for that territory, for that land, that piece of land. And Thomas Alexander says, I want to open up a cemetery for Protestants. Obviously, Alexander has some money, which I assumed, because he's able to purchase land like that. And he approaches the Presbyterians and he approaches the Episcopalians and says, I want you both to jointly manage this burial ground. That doesn't happen because he overhears the Episcopalian minister saying something derogatory about him. I don't know what it is. But Alexander gets very upset and goes to the Presbyterians and says, you guys are going to have this property. The trustees of the Presbyterian Church are like, no thank you, we don't want it, we cannot manage it, there's no way. The city needs to step in and do it. And the city's like, heck no, there's no way we're doing this. We're not getting into the cemetery business. So it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Finally, Dr. Andrew Anderson, the first, the second is the friend of Flagler. This is his father. Again, another historian nightmare when they name their son the same name. Please don't ever do that. So Dr. Anderson the first and Elias Gould get together. Elias just happens to be the mayor and say, we're going to take ownership of this property. And so they do. And that's how the Huguenot Cemetery wound up in the Presbyterian Church deed book. So, it's anybody taking the Huguenot Cemetery class Saturday? There are a couple of y'all. Okay, so we'll see the cemetery, we'll do a tour. But the first, well, I'm not worried about it. The first burial in there is like 1821 or 1819, very, very early on, and then you start having burials in the cemetery. And it's interesting because you have really, everybody assumes that they're all Protestants, but they're not. There are actually some Catholics that are buried in the Huguenot Cemetery because they were Masons and they wanted a Masonic symbol on their headstone, and the Catholics would not allow them to be buried in a Catholic cemetery. So they're not all Protestants that are buried in there. Okay. So the whole goal, once the congregation is formed, is to build a house of worship. So the plan for a union house of worship between the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians falls through. So Presbyterians realize it's up to them. And they have problems raising the money. They go to everybody and their brother and ask for money. But of course, in Florida, there's just not cash to be had. So Lathrop ends up going back up north. He eventually passes away. He's very sickly, which is the whole common theme around all of this, of these people that were coming to St. Augustine at this time period all have respiratory issues. Either they're TB patients or they have some other ailment. So you wonder, why are these people coming to St. Augustine? It's because this was where you would come to get well. Anyway, so it takes about 10 years for them to be able to build this house of worship. But it is made out of coquina. This is a picture, again, run through AI to make it color. But it looks right. It's got 3 doorways and some windows. Not the elaborate building that you would think of a Presbyterian church. Now, we have no idea what the interior looks like. There is an article that I read that mentions that they removed the pulpit so that they could put a Christmas tree up. I'm sure the minister did not like that. That's all we know. The pulpit was able to be moved. That's all. So, no idea what it looks like on the inside. But we do know where the wainscoting from the interior is located. Anybody know? They used to have a wooden wainscoting in the inside of the church. It's in the oldest house. 2nd floor. The wainscoting. Yeah, they recycled it. We're coming for your wainscoting. Thank you. So this is what the sanctuary looked like. Not very elaborate, but still pretty. It's very cute. It's on South St. George Street. Right across the street is Cathedral Parish School. So don't do it tonight, but tomorrow when you are driving around, trying to avoid traffic, take a stroll down South St. George Street, and when you come to CPS, look across the street and you're going to see a weird stone wall. That stone wall came from the bishop's rectory, where the Father Lopez statue was located by the cathedral. There used to be a house there, and that fence, or that wall, was there. They moved a part of it in front of a house, and there's like a little bronze plaque, and that tells you that that's the site of the original Presbyterian church. This is why Bridge Street is called Bridge Street. Most people are like, why is it called Bridge Street? There's no bridge. There used to be. So this was Maria Sanchez Creek, back when it was a creek and not a tidal pond. And that's Bridge Street, and there's the Presbyterian church in the back. Pretty cool photo. Okay, so there's the original. And this picture, this drawing, is actually in the Women's Exchange Pena Peck House. We were doing a tour for the lighthouse, and I saw it, and I took a picture of it, because I was like, I've never seen that before. So at some point during the use of that building, so about 1840 to 1890, so sometime in that 50-year period, there was a bell tower that was added to the front of the building. And the bell that's in the southeast tower used to hang in that bell tower. So when they tore this building down in 1890, when we moved into this building, they brought the bell over, they put it in storage, and it was Dr. Redding who ended up rescuing it and putting it down into the southeast bell tower. Okay, so here's the part that's entertaining. Now, when I told Mom I was doing a presentation on 200 years of Presbyterian history, she said, God, that sounds boring. Those of you who know my mother, that doesn't surprise you. Margie. So, she's family. So, this is the part that I thought would be entertaining. So these are the little stories. So why can't we just get along? This is Elias Gold and Peter Skeen Smith. Elias Gold, as we mentioned, was one of the ruling elders. William Blair ends up passing away and dying. I don't think it was yellow fever. I'm not quite sure what finished him off, but Elias Gold was the only ruling elder for a while until Peter Skeen Smith pops into town. And he comes, I want to say it's from Philadelphia, but he came from a very wealthy family. His father, who was also named Peter, was a partner of John Jacob Astor in the original partnership. So this guy had a lot of money. He had passed away, and Peter was on his second marriage, and he moves to St. Augustine and starts getting involved in politics. Well, Peter's brother is Garrett Smith, who you probably have no idea who that is. I didn't. But he was part of John Brown's Secret Six. So he was funding John Brown, who had the raid on Harper's Ferry, the abolitionist. Staunch abolitionist, okay? And Peter Smith was an abolitionist, but he didn't let you know it. So he kind of played the game a little bit, very political, and he runs for election, and I think he wins one election, loses another, but anyway, somewhere along the way, Elias Gold and Peter Skeen Smith clash. And Peter uses his influence to get Elias Gold thrown out, forces Elias Gold to resign from the Presbyterian Church. And Gould and his family move over to Trinity Episcopal. Peter Skeen Smith, his middle name comes from the name of the chief of the Oneida Indians that his father Peter had worked with and knew. It is Shenandoah. So if you are over in the Abbott Tract, you'll notice that there's a Shenandoah Street. It actually should have been Shenandoah because Peter Smith was a developer, and Peter was the first to develop Moore City. So it was his idea to start developing outside the city gates. He builds a hotel, he starts selling land, and then there's a panic in 1840, and he loses pretty much everything. And he sells it to Lucy Abbott, and Lucy Abbott is the one who ends up developing the Abbott Tract. Interesting little fact, though, is that Peter lived in Yalhalla, the plantation that's on Bridge Street that just recently got completely renovated. It's the oldest building in St. Augustine for a while. So he lived there, and these are pictures of the building back then. Doesn't look the same now, thank God. But anyway. So bitter enemies. Elias lasts longer, though. Peter gets run out of town, basically, because he starts owing money, starts really ticking people off, and that doesn't work in St. Augustine, so he got basically chased out of town, and he ends up going back up to Philadelphia. So the answer to that question is, why can't we all just get along? Just because. Henry Axtell was a minister that came, and he was stated supply. So with ministers, you had a supply pastor who was a temporary fill for a couple of years. There were several of those during the early years of the church, of the congregation, before we began to really call our ministers. And a call meant that the congregation was extending a job offer, essentially, to a minister, and that meant that you were going to pay them a wage as well as living expenses. The church could not afford that until like the 1860s, well, it's actually after the 1860s, about 1870s, after the Civil War. You start seeing ministers coming in and receiving a call. But what's really interesting about this is they have if you're familiar with Dave's massacre, took place in December of 1835. This is really the launching point of the Second Seminole War. The First Seminole War ended with the Treaty of Moultrie. The Second Seminole War starts with the Americans breaking the previous treaty and the Indians launching this massacre of Lieutenant Dade and his men. It took them 7 years to get the remains back from the middle of the forest where the men were slain. And those giant pyramids that you see in the National Cemetery, that is where the men are buried. And that's the monument to them. And there was a huge ceremony. You had a Catholic minister who makes an address. You have an Episcopalian minister who reads a portion of the service, and then Reverend Extel is the one who ends the prayer and then leads them back to the Presbyterian Church for the final portion of the ceremony. So there's a huge to-do about the dedication of the gravesite. One of my favorite stories is Rufus Sewell. He looks kind of like a dweeb in his portrait, but he decides, he's a very interesting guy, very Renaissance man, historian, naturalist, reads a lot, but he does something you should never do. And that is, he tells his opinion within his little tour book about what he thinks about Menorcans. And so Menorcans and St. Augustine are a protected class. So if you can imagine coming into a society, because the Menorcans came during the British period and stayed during the Second Spanish period. So if you can imagine being dark-skinned in the South and not being African, that is what the Menorcans faced, the discrimination that they faced. So here comes little old Rufus King Sewell writing a tour book about St. Augustine, and he says that the present race of Menorcans were of servitile extract, which is basically calling them enslaved blacks. Menorcans, like, no, you don't. And they surrounded his house with pitchforks and torches and were ready to kill him, but he went out the back door and ran all the way back to Philadelphia and never comes back. But what this highlights is the anti-Catholic feeling. That is the root of what Sewell is talking about. It's not really a racial thing. It's more about the anti-papalism that's going on within America at that time. This is the time of the Know Nothing Party. The people that you would ask them, well, you went to a meeting last night, what did you do? I don't know anything. That's why they call them Know Nothing, because they wouldn't talk about anything that they did. But it's nativism, talking about, if you're born in America, you're Protestant, you're white, et cetera, et cetera. One of the other quotes, their women are distinguished for their taste, neatness, and industry, a peculiar light olive shade of complexion, and a dark full eye. The males are less favored, both by nature and habit. They lack enterprise. Most of them are without education. Yeah, what do you think was going to happen, dude? So, eventually the presbytery, because he's a pastor, he's been called to the congregation, you can't just not show up at church. So the presbytery basically says, you need to either come back or you need to find another place to work. And he eventually gives up his post. But yeah, not a good time. But you can actually look this up. It's Sketches of St. Augustine. You can get it online, free copy, and read it, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Why donate just one bell when you can have two? So this is Frederick Markland, who donated our bell. So he donates the bell. It gets hung in the church in the old building. Do I have a picture? I don't have a picture of it, do I? Well, we talked about that, but anyway, it's in the southeast tower now. And so at one point the church says, well, we're going to send the bell to be cleaned in New York City, and we're going to take one of the chandeliers from the sanctuary and have it cleaned as well. And so they load it in a ship, and the ship promptly sinks off the coast of Georgia. So then they're like, well, great, now we don't have a bell and a chandelier. They actually found the chandelier. So Markham comes up and says, you know what? I'll give you another bell. He's got plenty of money. So that's the bell that we now have hanging in the bell tower. So it took 2 bells, but the second one took. And as I said, David Redding is the one that had the mechanism up there to hang it, and we ring it every Sunday before worship service. Okay. So as we're getting into the Civil War, what am I doing on time? Okay, 8 o'clock, all righty. So as we're moving through the Civil War, towards the Civil War, the Presbyterian Church ends up splitting. And it's largely because of this man right there, and what they call the Spring Resolutions, and it's named for Reverend Gardner Spring. And basically what it does is it requires the church, members and officers to sign a pledge to the federal government, to the U.S. government. And this is in 1861. Presbyterians are like, no, we're not going to do this. And so what eventually happens is you have the Southern Church split off from the Northern Church. And they create a separate Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America. It's a lengthy title, but essentially what they're doing is they're declaring their independence. And what they basically say is that the church should not be weighing in on political issues, instead only on religious issues. The state can handle the political issues, we're going to handle the religious ones, which makes sense. And the issue of slavery, of course, is a political issue, but they said we're not going to weigh in on that because that's a political thing, not for us to do. So St. Augustine is a Confederate town. And so the Presbyterian Church really kind of goes through kind of a split because there are still a lot of Unionists and people supporting the Union in the Presbyterian Church. And what ends up happening is the session meets on July 17th of 1861 for the last time until the end of the war. And so the church basically closes. They take the bell down, they lock up the church. It gets used for a number of different things, which I promptly did not talk about. Oh, I know why. We're going to skip ahead. They had a forced evacuation of the Confederate supporters in St. Augustine. And where did they have the place where all of the Confederate supporters are supposed to come? The Presbyterian Church. So they bring all of these people that are known Confederate supporters into the Presbyterian Church, and the Union Army says to them, you are going to have to pledge allegiance to the United States, or we're going to put you on a ship and send you into Confederate territory. Most of the people have to go because their children are fighting this for the Confederacy. So most of the people end up getting forced onto a ship. Imagine being told that you're leaving St. Augustine right now, you can't grab anything, we're putting you on a ship and we're taking you up to Jacksonville, and you wind up in Lake City on purpose. So that didn't go over real well. And it's like a PR nightmare. And the Union Army ends up coming back and rescinding the order. And they're like, what the hell were you thinking? So anyway, the Union comes in on March 11th, 1862, and St. Augustine becomes a Union-occupied city. This is the St. Augustine Blues flag. It's actually in the Confederate Museum in Richmond. Tracy Upchurch has actually had this picture taken with that. So I know it's authentic, but anyway. So the church comes back into session, the session meets on July 19th, 1865 for the first time. And they call a new minister, Charles O. Reynolds, as the new pastor. And they align themselves with the Presbytery of Philadelphia. So they're siding with the Northern Church. That doesn't change until the 1980s. That's a long time. And then they promptly asked the Philadelphia Presbytery for $1,000. Good deal. And basically what that is for the pastors, for the call, for the pastor. Okay. Presbyterian parsonage, we call it the manse, but for some reason they keep calling it the parsonage in the church records, is purchased from a man named Orloff Dorman, and I didn't make up that name. He's an abolitionist as well, but the parsonage allows for the minister to be in the center of town, and that building sat where the Columbia is today. So when you go and eat at the Columbia, you're hanging out with the Presbyterian ministers of old. And the ministers would publish in the paper, and this is an example of that with Edwin Knox Mitchell, when they would receive guests. So you could come by, any member of the church could come by and visit with the minister. And in fact, the Marshes of Glen, the poet, Sidney Lanier, comes to St. Augustine, and most VIPs that would come to St. Augustine found their way into the Presbyterian manse or parsonage. There's another picture of a huge palm tree over there. The next thing the church does is they build a Sunday school facility, and this is the chapel. You can see it in this picture here next to the Ponce, because it was next door to the church, and then they move it in 1870 down behind the government house. And this is before Cathedral Place cut through to Cordova. And so it sat there until about 1890, and then the Presbyterians sell it to the Sisters of St. Joseph. And if you're familiar with where St. Agnes is located, that's where it was moved to North City. And the sisters they tear down the chapel years later and build a new one about 1920s. We all recognize that guy, I hope. Flagler really does change things in St. Augustine. But I want to talk real quick about the Merritt Mather Parrott Presbyterian Church. It is an African-American church that was here in St. Augustine, and it was a Presbyterian church. It's formed in 1870. They had just built a building across the street from Flagler's Alcazar Hotel. Now, you know Flagler. Everything's about his hotel guests. He doesn't like the idea that there's a black church right across the street from his hotel guests. So he offers to buy the property, and they could use that money to build a new building. And that's what they do. And they actually demolish the building, but then they reuse the wood. And that is the building that they end up moving into. And it was at the corner of Washington and Park Place in the heart of Lincolnville. And on the first floor, it was schoolrooms. And then on the weekends, for church, they would have church there, Sunday school and then church. And then the second floor is where the minister and his wife lived. And for a very, very long time, James Cooper, Reverend Cooper, was the one that ran that school. And they called it Reverend Cooper School. A lot of the black children grew up calling it that, because he was there forever. But they were under a completely different presbytery. They weren't even the same presbytery as Memorial was, under the Knox Presbytery. And they were funded through the Board of Missions, the National Presbyterian Church, Board of Missions for Freedmen. And they received funding from the Buckingham Smith Benevolent Association as well. So very active church until about the 1980s, 1990s. And then it just kind of fell apart. A lot of the churches, a lot of African-American churches became, or African-Americans joined the AME church, or more of the black denominations, and less like traditional Presbyterians. Okay. Alrighty. So, oops, I did this. Did I? Yes, you did. Buckingham Smith writes a letter to William Seward who was the Secretary of State under President Abraham Lincoln. And this is right as the Civil War begins. And he says, listen, I'm from St. Augustine. Why has the Union not captured St. Augustine? There are a ton of Unionists in St. Augustine, and you would be doing them a huge favor. So like a month later, the Union comes down to Fernandina, takes Fernandina, and then they come down to St. Augustine, and they come into the harbor, and there's like this little group of Unionists that come out onto the dock to welcome them, and they're like, ooh, that doesn't look like very many Unionists. So Buckingham Smith might have been exaggerating just a tad, but yes, the Union does take St. Augustine, and you can blame his letter to William Seward for that happening. But Seward is also the one who arranged the purchase of Alaska, so can't be too mad at him. That is Buckingham Smith's property. So his mother, her name is Hannah, and if you kind of know your area, that's very awfully near where we're sitting right now. So I think her property was actually where the church campus is located now. Kind of give you some correlation. Okay, we talked about that. Sarah Mather and Rebecca Parrott were two elderly women in St. Augustine who taught. They had a girls' school in the very beginning. And then after the Civil War, they began to teach African American children. That is why that Mather Parrott name should ring familiar, because the Presbyterian Church was named, the Black Presbyterian Church was named in honor of them for their work with black children. But they also taught the Indians at the fort when they were incarcerated at the fort. I believe it was Sarah Mather who knew a connection with the captain overseeing the incarceration of the Indians and talked him into letting them come in and teach. And there were a whole bunch of women that went in and started to teach them English and how to read and write. Sarah and Rebecca are actually buried together in Evergreen Cemetery. That is their marker. Draw your own conclusions. Okay, and then Henry Flagler gets into trouble when he's building the church. So at the last minute, they've got the dedication ceremony set, 1890. They've got the dignitaries are coming, the vice president and his wife, and the First Lady of the United States are coming for the dedication service. And Flagler checks with Prayer and Hastings, are we good to go? We got all these people coming, and they're running around, if you can imagine, painting the walls, getting the stucco on the walls at the last minute. And then they look outside, and there are no palm trees. Got to plant the palm trees. So the workers make the mistake of planting trees and finishing the work on the exterior on the Sabbath. It sends up an uproar, and that is what this article is basically talking about how somebody is guilty, but it's not the members of the Presbyterian Church or the minister, so lay off, cut them some slack. It's whoever Flagler had hired to do the work. So little old St. Augustine could still get riled up about little things like that. And so one thing I do want to talk about is the Roosevelt organ. And I had always, coming to church here, I'd always heard that the reason that the Roosevelt organ was removed in the 1970s and the Aeolian Skinner came in, and Matt, you'll appreciate this, he's our organist, is that the Roosevelt organ was falling apart. It wasn't really in great condition. What I've come to understand is it really was actually quite an organ. And Henry Flagler probably handpicked the Roosevelt Organ Company because they were out of New York, and they were probably one of the premier organ builders in the country. And so the casework of the organ is what you see behind us. So with the white pipes, very similar. Actually, we painted the casework of the organ to look like mahogany about 10 years ago. It used to be white back there. And then you didn't have the gilding at the very top. So we added that because we figured that's what Henry Flagler would have probably wanted anyway, and it looks better. But Flagler had a cousin named Isaac von Flagler. Great name. And he was a founding member of the American Guild of Organists. And so he would come to visit his cousin, Henry, in St. Augustine, and he would come and give recitals here at Memorial. And probably was instrumental, no pun intended, in getting the Roosevelt organ to install, or organ company to install the organ here at Memorial. And it stayed in service until 1970 when the AOE Skinner was installed. Okay, going in the wrong direction. Okay, so I want to have enough time for questions. So let me hit the highlights. Y'all know that story, I hope. And I'm not doing a part 2, so don't ask. Some very interesting ministers. John McGonigal was heavily tied to the Rollins College in Winter Park. He taught there after he was a minister here. He was very devoted to education. But he came from Oil City, Pennsylvania. And I did not know that the city with that name existed, but it did. And apparently one of our church members is actually from Oil City, and she's like, I went to church there. So anyway, McGonigal is the guy who helped decide the theme of our stained glass windows. The Apostles' Creed changes very little between the different denominations, and so that is why they chose it. And it starts up there and works its way around the sanctuary. Most of the windows were too narrow to do a picture. The east wall is the exception, and that was the last section to be installed. So you were missing for a good few years, you were missing the beginning of the Apostles' Creed until they installed those windows. But Herman Schlattermuth, who when I started here was referred to as a German immigrant, he actually was from Milwaukee and went by the name Pete. How do you get Pete out of Herman? I don't know. But anyway, that's who designed our stained glass windows, and his granddaughter came through when I was a docent here and just fell in love with the place. She started crying immediately because she said it was just so gorgeous, and she came on a really good day when it was nice and sunny. Alfred Badner, his claim to fame is he had the unfortunate task of being the pastor at Memorial when Henry Flagler died. And so that is a colorized picture of the sanctuary for Henry Flagler's funeral. I don't think there was a flower left in St. Augustine when he died. But they had a funeral service here. Flagler was laid in state at the Ponce de Leon Hotel, and then they had the interment in the mausoleum, which you can go and see is on your way out tonight if you haven't been in there. But they had a private interment with the family in the mausoleum. Barton Bigler and the ladies, that's really not what he's known for. That was just a picture. They had picnics. They did a lot of picnics, and that was a picture we had of him with some of the women from the church. Okay, alrighty. So last thing we'll end with. So the manse next door in 1926, Jean Flagler Matthews came along. I'm sorry, that's not right. Louise Weiss Lewis came along and offered to pay for an auditorium to be added onto the manse. So basically what they were doing was we needed some space for Sunday school and we needed some fellowship space. And so Louise was the great niece, or was the niece of Mary Lily Keenan, and her sister was Mary Lily's sister. Or I'm sorry, her mother was Mary Lily's sister. And so when Mary Lily died, she did not have any children, and so she left the bulk of her estate to Louise. Louise wasn't really in with the whole Flagler thing. She sold Whitehall in Palm Beach to some hotel investors, which they turned it into a hotel. But she did donate the money for the fellowship hall to be added on to the manse. And then she purchased the big white house, the Ingram House, which is up there, to be used as a manse. And the stipulation with her donation to the church was that it would always be known as the Mary Lily Keenan Manse, Mary Lily Keenan Flagler Manse. And so the minister lived there until just before Dr. John Hunter came, and Dr. Hunter was the first pastor of the church to be given a housing allowance rather than have him live in the manse, and that became church offices. So all of that basically to say that Louise Wise was the one that allowed us to grow out of the sanctuary. Okay, so we're going to skip a doodle. Don't look. We had a pastor with a flair for the dramatic. This is Bob Lance. He would dress up in costume. Mom and Dad remember this and still laugh about it, or they were laughing about it, because he would dress up as different biblical characters and deliver the sermon. I don't imagine that went over real well in the Presbyterian church, but apparently it was good. Oh, and here's a picture y'all love. That's me. And that's my sister. That was my brush with fame. One thing I do want to say, and Mary Catherine and I talked about this before I started, was I want to make sure I give Karen Harvey props. She, in 1999, wrote a book called Flagler's First Presbyterians, and we had about 5 million copies of this book in the basement. And somebody had the thought of putting them up on top of tables, because they were in the basement of the manse, and the manse got flooded during one of the hurricanes. None of the books were damaged. But Karen did a lot of the research and went out and met with former members of the church, former pastors who are gone now. And so a lot of the stories and stuff that have come out tonight and in other areas are largely because of her work. So I want to make sure I thank Karen Harvey for that. She did a great job with that book. Oh, and this is John Hunter. This was a picture, and I was here. We were caroling at the Samantha Wilson nursing home where Bayview is. And Janet Graham was our organist, fantastic organist, but she was very good with voice. She headed up the St. Augustine chorus and did the Messiah every year in the sanctuary. And John Hunter went with us, who was our pastor at the time, and she said, whoever has the strongest voice, get in front of John Hunter, because he can't sing. And I was standing right next to him, and she was right. Flat as a board. Awful. And that's Janet Graham. She always walked around with a fan. She was always hot. And then that's her doing what I call her thing. You could follow her hair, because the organ's right behind that center panel of the choir screen. So you would see part of her hair on the left, part of her hair on the right when she was playing. So some of the reminders that we have of our past. These are things that we have that we use on a regular basis in the church. The baptismal chalice, we have the baptismal font here, but it does have cracks in it. So Hunter has started using has been using the baptismal chalice, which was given to the church in 1832 by Mary Anderson, who was, I believe, the mother of Dr. Anderson the first. I think that's right. That may not be right. Is that right, Beth? Okay. If you don't know, then I'm not going to worry about it. We had the communion serving that was given by Hannah Anderson in 1832, which was also, I think that was his wife. I think that's right. So we use these every time there's a baptism, every time we have communion. If you watch Hunter and Rachel, when they do the communion, pouring of the wine, they're using the chalice and the cups. The bell, obviously. We have Dr. Wilson's chair, which is in the chapel and to the left in the congregational history room. That was his writing desk. He would have lived in the old manse where the Columbia is, and that's where he would have written some of his sermons. And that's a picture of him when he was much younger, probably about the age of being a pastor here. And then lastly, these little suckers. So the story is that those coquina pillars, and you'll see them when you walk out, are made from the coquina of the old sanctuary. When it was torn down, they remade them. And that's typical for Flagler. Flagler did a lot of that where he recycled material. When the cathedral burned and Flagler redid the cathedral, some of that coquina wound up in the garden of the Ponce de Leon Hotel along the edging. So it's very possible. I have a bit of a time problem because I think when this book came out with these pictures, the church was still standing. But it's a great story. I don't know if it's true or not. But anyway, but that is it. Thanks, y'all. Once you get me talking, I don't stop. That's the problem. So what questions do y'all have? Everybody's just odd. Oh, this is good. So the Roosevelt organ served the church from 1890 to 1926. And I'm sorry, that's not true, 1970. In 1926, it was enlarged. At one point, the Roosevelt organ, they added pipes up above the balcony where those pipes are. Those are fake pipes. That screen, those were from the original Roosevelt organ. So when they rebuilt the organ, or when they installed the alien Skinner, they just used the same screen. But then they also had pipes down over the balcony. The problem was that because we have this problem of humidity in Florida, when the organist would hit the keyboard and it would send the electric current to the pipes, it would sometimes jump from one wire to the other. So you would think you're getting a soft, mellow sound, and all of a sudden you have the full organ. So they ended up not really using it. All of that was ripped out in 1970 with the alien Skinner. So solved that problem. Megan. So after Matthew, what kind of renovations did we have? We got a state grant, thank you, to do the exterior. And so we did a lot of replacement of terracotta, a lot of waterproofing, replaced roof, parts of the roof, and then we also had to work on the dome. The dome had a big cut in it. So if y'all remember the cross falling over during Irma, it got caught in the rungs of the ladder that you used to climb up to the very top. That was the only thing that stopped it from falling onto the ground, which would not have been a good thing. So we repaired all of that. So a lot of roof work, a lot of waterproofing. Yeah, a lot of money.
Do you know how the Huguenot Cemetery got its name?
So how did the Huguenot Cemetery get its name? So I think, and my best guess is from what I've read, that it's a holdover from the kind of romantic tourist literature that was circulating around that time, that romanticism. Like, there's a great story about a couple that is visiting St. Augustine, and they're in love, and they get a boat, and they go over to the lighthouse and spend the day in the shadow of the lighthouse, and you're like, that would never happen. First off, you wouldn't be stupid enough to get a boat and go over to the island, because then you'd have to go through all that marsh that is now Davis Shores. So it's that history of the Huguenot massacre and all of that resurfaces a lot in those stories. But there's no connection to the Huguenot Society. There's a Huguenot Society in South Carolina. No connection. So your guess is as good as mine. Yes, sir. Which building are we talking about? For this building? It was done within a year. Yeah, it's amazing what will happen when you're a Standard Oil partner and you have millions to burn. But it was not this day and night by torchlight stuff that you hear. Articles that I've read equate the workforce to about 200. They had built Flagler College, the Ponce de Leon Hotel. They went across and built the Alcazar Hotel. The Alcazar is technically not finished because there's the front end that they never do build. And the workmen were pulled off that project and brought to construct the church. Flagler wanted it done so that they could honor the 1-year anniversary of his daughter's death. So he got it done. The architects for the church and most of Flagler's buildings here was Carrere and Hastings, John Carrere and Thomas Hastings. Thomas Hastings was the son of Flagler's minister in New York. That helps. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. So the schism in the Presbyterian Church, now there's a chart that I did not show y'all, because I started going down this, what I call a rabbit hole, and it's very, very deep, about what happens with the Presbyterian Church after the split right around the Civil War. And it takes a chart to understand where it all comes in. So I'm going to do the Reader's Digest and just say they come back together in the 1980s. And save you the turmoil of having to try to figure out where it goes. It's very, very wonky. CJ. So the number of members of the church is about 100. It's not very big. So he did not build this church strictly for the Presbyterian congregation because he knew its proximity to the hotels would bring hotel guests over here. And he was absolutely right about that. A lot of the choir members, the groups that would do music here in the sanctuary were all employees of the hotel. So it was very common for them to have some sort of musical program over in the hotel, and then those same people would come over here for church services. One of the things I don't mention, and I wanted to make sure I did this, the organist for the church, when they first moved into this building, was one of the church members. It was a woman named Florence Bevan, and they kept a scrapbook. And you can go in the Historical Society and drive them nuts looking at the Bevan scrapbook because she cut every single article out of the newspaper related to the church, but especially the ones where they talk about how great her organ playing is. If it could be that big, as long as it's Mrs. Bevan did a great job, slather that in there. There's an organist who comes to St. Augustine named Russell Joy, who he was a seasonal organist for Flagler at Whitehall. So Flagler hired an organist to play at Whitehall whenever he wanted, because he had an organ there. And so he tells Russell to come over and meet Florence Bevan, and that Florence has been asking for a stop of the organ to be added to the Roosevelt organ. And she wanted a vox humana stop, which is supposed to mimic the human voice. Russell Joy sends a letter to his sister, and Whitehall has saved all of these letters. And Russell says to his sister, Florence Bevan wouldn't know a vox humana if it hit her square between the eyes, but he ends up becoming Flagler's kind of organist, but he ends up coming back to Memorial and becoming our organist for a while as well. So I got a million of them. Some of them are true. Yes. Right, so the design comparing this church to the other churches that you saw, Keep in mind, you're in the middle of the Gilded Age. And so churches in New York were like this. If you go into a lot of those churches now, I'm thinking of St. Thomas, I think, on Fifth Avenue, gorgeous stained glass and very heavily decorated. That was common in New York. And it goes more in line with the gospel of wealth belief, that if you're wealthy, you have done something to deserve that wealth. And so there's kind of a change in mentality from the old Protestant work ethic to this idea that, you know, these people who were coming to church had earned a special status, and so therefore the rules don't necessarily apply to them. Funny how that works out. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Good question. So the electricity. So I had always argued that the Ponts had electricity. They had an Edison generator. Why didn't they have power in the church? There was no power. We find no way that the church was ever electrified until 1928. So the chandeliers and the torches at the ends of the pews, all the lighting fixtures would have been gas. And if you look under the chandeliers, you can see the pull chain. If you pull it in one direction, the gas would flow. Pull it in the other direction, the gas would shut off. Yeah. It's very creepy in here, when it's dark, especially with the stained glass. But before they had the stained glass, they had like a pale glass window with shades. So it's still kind of creepy. I hate to say that about a church, but while I'm being irreverent. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so we were talking about Dr. Johnson from Flagler came into the church, and I was telling somebody that was the strangest experience I've ever had, because Tim Johnson saw the exterior of the church, the main entrance being the south entrance, which we never use. I mean, even tonight we had no usher down there because nobody ever comes in that side. When he walked in, he was stunned because he expected to see the pulpit and the organ and everything on this end, not this end. So the story, as I've heard, is that there is twofold. Part of it is that they wanted somewhere for Sunday school. And one of the things that I hope you got out of the presentation tonight is the importance of Sunday school to the early church and to the continuing of the Presbyterian congregation. Education has always been a big fixture. So they wanted somewhere for Sunday school, and there was a building design called the Akron Plan that came out of Akron, Ohio. And the idea at that time was you would have a separate space for Sunday school. Typically you'd have an auditorium, and then you would have classrooms on the sides. And so the classes would go away and do their meet, and then they'd come back together. But that whole space was blocked off by using pocket doors. And that's what those mahogany doors are. So this was an incorporation of a very up-and-coming trend in church building with the classical design that Carrere and Hastings were known for. So it's kind of a blending of a new idea with an old idea. But that is what that was used for, was for Sunday school. We use that now for a chapel, for smaller services and that sort of thing. CJ. Hot. No, they would have used the sanctuary. Up until the 1960s, the windows would open. So you had these small square windows on the wainscoting level. Those windows would slide, so you would have ventilation coming through there. And then the large stained glass windows would pull out, and so you would have ventilation from there. And that was it. And lots of fans, I would imagine. But yeah, good question. And believe it or not, and I didn't send this to Hunter because I didn't want to give him any ideas, but the pastor would take the summer off. And the congregation would actually not meet. They would do, occasionally they would do what they call union services, where they would have a group of congregations get together, so there would be different denominations, and one church would host one week, the next week would be another church, and they would all go to that particular church. So it was a good way for them to get to know the community, but it was also a good way to not be in a hot church every single Sunday. Different buildings, I guess, had different ventilation, but okay. Well, if you have any other questions, stop me, let me know. But y'all, thank you for coming. Have a great evening. Appreciate it very much.